Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends. Thanks a lot for tuning in to yet another episode of Pushing Beyond the Obvious. As you all know, this entire season of Pushing Beyond the Obvious is focused around leadership and how can we make leaders more effective and more influential and do the right things for themselves, for their teams, and for their organizations, and for the society as well. So in that series, I'm really glad to be hosting Dr. ALAN BARNARD. So he's the CEO of Goldratt Research Labs and has been, a close confidant and also has worked with Dr. Eli Goldratt. If you have listened to any of my shows in the past, you would know how big a fan I am of Dr. Eli Goldratt and the work that he has done. You all know that I would have read The Goal multiple times, and every time I read the book, there is something new that comes as an insight for me based on the current situation that I'm in, and I've recommended the book not enough times. So with that, welcome, Dr. ALAN. Thanks a lot for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Mukesh.
So first things first, as I told you in our conversation before we hit the record button as well, I'm a huge fan of the work of Dr. Eli Goldratt. I've consumed everything that I could find on YouTube or elsewhere where Dr. Goldratt talks about his philosophy. So maybe before we go in, personal curiosity, how was it like knowing him as a person and working with him? And what were some of the key insights or key learnings that you had when you did work with him?
Well, I read The Goal when I was studying industrial engineering, and I literally couldn't wait to apply it. So soon after graduating, I became head of engineering for a very large manufacturing company that made cookware. And we were able to implement it in our factory. And we literally doubled our throughput without increasing OPEX or CAPEX. We increased our due date performance from around 30% to 100%. And we ended up essentially developing our own ERP system that was all based on theory of constraints. In the process, I really wanted to meet Eli. I wanted to find out from him how did this character Jonah in the book know what questions to ask? Because one of Dr. Goldratt's famous mottos was, the best solution starts with the right questions, right? A true expert is not the one that can give you the right solution, it's the one that can give you the right question. So I was able to meet him, and I think that first meeting was an indication about how our relationship is going to be for the rest of our life. It was filled with big highs and a few lows. I was in utter admiration of his genius and the insights that he shared, but we quickly got into a really bad argument. And I thought, wow, this is not going the way I wanted this to go, And I had asked him a question about a really difficult challenge that I was facing at the time, is how do you maintain very high due date performance when you are doing promotions, when essentially your retail clients can order whatever they want, right? Of course, they give you a forecast, but the forecast is always inaccurate. And he looked at me and he said, so you're quite lazy, aren't you? It's like, what? I've paid $10,000 to be at your seminar, and you ask me if I'm lazy? You don't know me. I work my butt off. And he said to me, listen, even if I knew, and I'm not going to tell you if I know or not, but I wouldn't tell you. And he could see I was upset, and he said, listen, if you want your money back, just ask me and I'll give it back to you. But think about it. And of course, I thought about it that night. I didn't sleep. And I found a solution to the problem. And I went back to him the next morning. And I saw him standing at the coffee, and in my most sarcastic tone of voice, I said, thank you so much, Dr. Goldratt, for the wonderful advice that you gave me. And he grabbed me by the arm and he sat me down very forcefully. And he said to me, so did you solve the problem? I said, yes, I did. He said, how do you feel? I said, I get your point. It feels pretty amazing. And, it still chokes me up to think about that. But he basically said to me, why would I steal the opportunity from you to invent your own solution? And he said, by the way, I didn't think that this was a solvable problem. How did you solve it? And, in that moment, we formed this connection. And I was extremely fortunate to stay connected very, very closely with him until he sadly passed away in 2011. But I learned so much from him. Probably one of the most important lessons I learned was from that first meeting. He said to me, okay, now that we've got that out of the way, tell me what's your goal. And I shared with him a lot of things I wanted to achieve in my life, and he was just shaking his head. He said, no. I said, what do you mean? How can you disagree with my goal? And he said, no, clearly your definition of a goal is different to mine. And when we do science, that's the first thing that you start with, is you define precisely what you're talking about. So he apologized, said, let me give you my definition. He said, a life goal is simply a dream taken seriously.
Wow.
What is your dream? And I said, I wanted to help people make better decisions when it really, really matters, to unlock their inherent potential. And he said, that sounds good. How are you going to take this dream seriously? And it's a question that inspires and haunts me every day, So that's probably by far the biggest lesson I've learned. And I think for all the viewers out there and listeners, it's an important question to ask yourself from time to time, Do you have a dream? It takes a lot of courage to have a dream. And then if you say yes, then, have you given up on it? Or are you taking it seriously?
It's profound and simple at the same time. It's profound in its simplicity, I think. Very like the Eli that I know, and I have the impression in my mind after having read everything that is written and after having listened to so much of what he talks about. So before we go any further, right? So thanks for sharing that story. I think it raises a lot of questions and thoughts in my mind about what is my dream, and that I need to take seriously, and how am I going to achieve.
I'll share with you just one more nugget that hopefully will get you to think, and also the audience. Something else I've learned from him is he said, I will not sacrifice my goal for anyone. I will not sacrifice anyone for my goal.
Wow. That's balance.
Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting riddle to resolve, right?
Yeah. So like everything else, the conflict clouds that he talks about, there is a conflict, and
yes,
you
how
resolve
do you
it.
resolve it in a win-win way?
Yeah, so that's amazing. So before we move any further, for those of the viewers or listeners who have not come across Dr. Goldratt's work, or who do not understand what TOC as a framework is, can you just maybe explain what the fundamentals of theory of constraints are?
I think that there's you can think about it in the following way. It claims that every system has a constraint, at least one, that's holding it back. So then you say, well, what is a constraint? Because in common language, we use constraint for many different things, right? Anything that sort of limits us from improving, we call a constraint. In theory of constraints, what Goldratt did, which I think is quite profound, he said, look, any system has a goal, right? And that goal determines the resources that's required and how much of each resource is required. A constraint is simply a resource that you don't have enough of to achieve the goal. So it's not a problem, it's not an obstacle, it's not a policy, it's not a measurement. It's a resource that you don't have enough of to achieve the goal. And if you think about it, it can be only one of a few things, right? I have a goal, whether my goal is an income or impact goal, I need enough demand to meet that goal. So do I have enough demand for the product or service that I provide? If not, then that's my constraint. I could have enough demand, but I don't have enough capacity to deliver or fulfill that demand reliably and profitably. I could also not have enough supply of some external input that I require, raw materials, etc. Or I don't have enough cash to afford enough of the supply to produce enough of the product or service to meet the demand. So that's the fourth one. So it could be demand or capacity or supply of cash. The one that took us a long time to figure out is probably the ultimate constraint, which is even if you have all of those things, there's many, many opportunities to improve your system. And that puts a demand on management attention. So that's the ultimate constraint, is the number of things that demand our attention will always exceed our available attention. So what theory of constraint says to us is there will always be at least one constraint, sometimes more than one, right? I might not have enough demand and supply and cash and management attention. That's just chaos, right? But if you can find that one, the weakest link, and focus all your efforts on that, that's the way to get the most impact or income at the lowest possible cost or investment. So there will always be at least one constraint. Focus everything on that constraint. And there's two ways that you can improve a constraint or resolve it.
Yeah.
The one is just make sure you don't waste it, right? And that's true for any scarce resource. So if demand is your constraint, think about you have only 5% of the market, of your existing market, right? You're wasting 95%. Like, what are the conditions that if you could satisfy them, you could get your existing clients to buy more, pay more, buy more frequently? Same with capacity. We waste our capacity by overproducing, producing stuff that's not needed or not needed now. Imagine you're a software company and you have a development constraint, right? I remember when I was at SAP at the first time, and I was teaching, theory of constraints to the team in Waldorf at SAP, and I asked them, where's your constraint? Where's their backlog, right? That's always an indication that you have a bottleneck. And they said it's our top development resources. And these guys are already working, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It's like we can't get more out of them. And I asked them, how much of the functionality within your software are actually being used by your users? And I think that's true for any software, right? And it's normally around 20, 30%, which means 70% of that scarcest resource capacity is being wasted doing something that's not needed or not needed now. And the same is true for our own attention. By far, the majority of our attention is wasted by us doing things we shouldn't be doing. So that's always, after you've identified your constraint, decide how to not waste it, stop doing the things that are not helping or even harming. And then if it's still the constraint, then think about, elevating it, going to get more, hiring more salespeople, developing another product, going into a new market, etc. So that is kind of the essence of theory of constraints, is it helps us to decide where to focus.
Interesting. And if I remember correctly, one of the other things that the TOC as a framework talks about is the importance of flow and the importance of throughput, as to how in terms of velocity of flow, how quickly material is moving, or tasks are moving, or decisions are being made, and the quality of flow as well, or throughput as well. So that's something that I also found interesting, simply because of the fact that it's true in almost all scenarios. As long as we get flow, whether you take biology, whether you take chemistry, the only thing is that the pace at which the flow happens is probably different when compared to projects or manufacturing systems. But flow and throughput is probably the most important aspect, irrespective of whether we are looking at evolution, whether you're looking at chemical reactions, whether you're looking at manufacturing, whether you're looking at decision making inside of your own head. So
yes,
I thought that was also very insightful.
Absolutely. I think that there's an element that's maybe not that clearly understood, because we talk about flow as if it's one thing. But flow has two dimensions. So the first dimension is flow time, the total time that something spends inside of a system, right? And there's sort of three elements of the time in a system. There's the time in backlog, right? So a demand has been created, it arrives there, but I'm not yet starting on it, and now it's waiting in backlog. If I have a bottleneck, that backlog will grow and it will grow exponentially, right? But then once it enters the system, there's time in process, physical touch time or work time when I'm actually working on that thing, and then there's time in queue. And by far the biggest opportunity is reducing the time in queue by not pushing so much into the system, keeping it in backlog and controlling the release of flow into the system. So the flow time is a very important thing. We want to reduce that as much as possible. And the second dimension of flow is flow rate. So flow rate is similar to throughput, right? It's a rate at which I'm making money, the rate at which I'm generating gold units. My constraint will give me an upper limit on flow rate. But the system will always be under that, right? So my bottleneck can do 10 per hour. How much is the actual system doing? Only 5 per hour. How can it be? Why is my system doing less than the bottleneck? Because my bottleneck is being starved or blocked or under planned or unplanned maintenance or working on bad quality product or overproducing, right? So that's the key aspect is your constraint determines the upper limit of flow rate. So our first job is always, once we know what the bottleneck is, we compare the actual flow rate of the system versus the design capacity of the bottleneck, and we try to get that up. The second dimension, that flow time, is my critical path or critical chain determines my flow time. That determines my lower limit on the flow time. And I want to try to strip out all the avoidable delays to get it back to flow time. And that's how I'm improving flow. But there's the big discovery that Goldratt made was, he said, if you think about any system that you're trying to improve, right? You wanna improve the reliability of the system. You wanna reduce the time. You wanna increase the throughput. You wanna lower the cost. You wanna lower the investment. And he asked the question: is there one of these that, if you improved it, will almost automatically improve all the other ones? So if I had to create an objective function, right, or reward function for AI, right, what's the one thing that if we achieve that will improve everything? And it's flow. If I can improve flow, all the other things automatically improve. So that's why flow is such an important concept, not just in theory of constraints, but as you mentioned, in almost everything else, every other field, you know. And it's, when you think about a business, there's the flow of materials, there's the flow of cash, there's the flow of information, there's the flow of ideas. All of them will dramatically benefit if we can get the flow time down by reducing avoidable delays, and if we can get the flow rate up by avoiding capacity losses.
That's extremely insightful. And I think this applies not just in manufacturing plants where materials move, it also applies in projects. We had Efrat Goldratt on the show a few weeks back, and she spoke about how the same concepts can be applied in a project or multi-project environment. And I think the capacity constraints that the equivalent of improving flow, or one of the ideas of improving the flow, was the very necessity to stop doing multitasking, is something that she spoke about. And that's also what manufacturing plants do when they just plan for local optima, which is they plan to increase efficiency at each working unit, thereby creating chaos in the entire manufacturing plant. That's again something that Dr. Eli spoke about in the goal. So we want to make it real now. So I know there was this case that you spoke about on one of your videos about Tata Steel UK, and how they went from making £1 million per day loss to £1 million per day profit. So can you just explain what the situation was and what was the intervention and how did that change And what did the team learn from the entire experience?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting example. I worked very closely there with Bamlandra Jha, that was the CEO at the time. He came from Tata Steel India. I'd worked with him there to implement theory of constraints. He moved to Tata Steel UK, and what had happened initially, Tata India let Tata Steel UK kind of do their own thing. Said, we didn't want to push down any methodology. Even though theory of constraints worked very well for us, we're not going to push it down. And unfortunately, I never adopted it. So, the business kept on going down. And when he finally stepped in, it was a crisis situation. Like you mentioned, they were losing almost £1 million a day. And he wanted to do a complete shift. So how do you go about applying something like theory of constraints, right? So you can apply it in sequence. I mentioned the 5 types of constraints that you can get. So the first question that we had was, is the market the constraint? And at that stage in steel, and it's pretty much most of the time, whatever you can produce, you could sell. So it's not market demand. Then it's about capacity, right? Do I have enough capacity to be profitable? And that was where the biggest obstacle was, is yes, there's capacity, but somehow we are not utilizing the capacity or managing the capacity well. And it's something that you've read the goal a number of times, right? If you reread it again, there's a portion there where Jonah, the mentor, tells Alex Rogo, which is the plant manager that's in a crisis, he says, you don't know how to manage your capacity. That's the problem. You are wasting your capacity producing stuff that's not needed now. You're releasing stuff too early, right, or too much, etc. And I think what's very interesting is that on the surface, the principles are always simple and universal, right? Don't waste capacity producing stuff that's not needed. Or like you said, control your work in process. Don't multitask. These are principles that's universally applicable, and it's very simple to understand, but they're not enough. If you take a case like Tata, you then have to take that principle and turn it into very specific rules that says, how do I make sure I don't overproduce? What are the rules I'm going to be using? When do I release stuff? How much do I release? Because there's many options. Goldratt used a really great analogy in the years when he was selling his own software. He said, what makes chess such a difficult game? It's not that the rules to play the game is difficult. It's simple enough that you can teach it to a child. The same thing with, if you go into a new industry like steel, the actual rules to play the game is not that complicated. What's difficult to figure out is the rules to win the game, for 2 reasons. One, there are so many options, like in chess, that I can try. There's so many strategies and tactics that I can try. How do I know that which one is going to allow me to win? The second part is the strategies that often are successful are, like you explained, very counterintuitive. Global optimal rules are often very counterintuitive. And that was where we focused on. We were trying to figure out what is causing avoidable capacity losses. How can we avoid those losses? What are the most profitable products to produce? In which plants should we produce these products? In what way should we produce them? In what is the most profitable way to transport them to the company? And I think something that generically came out of there that was a big insight. Tata had a few years back hired one of the top consulting companies to identify for them what are the most profitable way to produce any coil of steel, and what's the most profitable way to transport that coil of steel to the customer. Now imagine you have this decision rules sitting in your IT system in SAP, right? So customer places an order. It says it's this grade of steel with this finish, this with this thickness, etc., this surface coating. It goes into this lookup table. It says this is the most profitable place to produce it, and here's the most profitable way to distribute it. And it gives the client the quote. When we got in there, what we found was there were areas that was massively flooded, right, with work, too much work in process. In fact, we couldn't find a parking bay because there were coils parked outside in the parking bay. There was just too much stuff in some plants, and other plants were almost completely starved of work. And this was a big lesson, is that theory of constraints says a constraint is important because you can't make commitments without considering constraints, right? But also how you allocate constraints can make a big, big difference. And what they were doing, they were using static rules to allocate capacity. What they should have done is they should have created a dynamic rule that considers the loading on resources at the moment and dynamically said, this is already over allocated. If we keep on giving it more work, the lead times will just grow exponentially. Our reliability will decay exponentially. So we need to move stuff to the second most profitable, manufacturing plant that has facilities. So just by doing these simple things, thinking about where are we losing capacity, where are we losing throughput, what's the cause of that, and coming up with very simple rules that can better allocate that scarce capacity is what essentially created that turnaround.
That's brilliant. So one thing that strikes me in the entire story is the fact that there are so many decisions to be made, right? So in terms of identifying which constraints, identifying what to optimize for, identifying and deciding what rules we need to put in place, and so many different things. And all of these are decisions that leaders need to make on a day-to-day basis, or at least at one point in time, and then embed it within the culture of the organization or the operating fabric of the organization, so that the rules are being followed. Because there are innumerable examples where you put in the rules, but nobody follows them. And it's just a waste of time, energy, money, and all of that. So as this season of the podcast is focused on leadership and how do we make them effective, I think one way to help leaders be a lot more effective is to help them make better decisions and to avoid making bad decisions. So from your experience, I know you teach decision making as well as part of your business as well. So what are some of the things that result in good people making bad decisions and how to avoid them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first one is that we completely underestimate the impact that emotions have on our decision making, right? You imagine a buyer that is being offered a great solution, maybe a technology solution like SAP. Why wouldn't they buy? We tend to think, well, they wouldn't buy if the benefit is not more than the cost, right? That there's no value, there's no ROI. But what if the benefit far exceeds the cost? Why would they not buy? And what we know from a psychological perspective is our emotions are trying to protect us from harm. So we often are, if a salesman pitches to us, if they say there's a benefit of 20 and the cost is 10, to protect ourselves, we look at that and go, salespeople always overpromise. So probably that 20 is 10, and they always underestimate the cost. So probably that cost of 10 is actually 20, and now I'm getting a negative value. And as a result, I don't buy, right? So that emotional fear of, making a bad decision can often cause us to look at reality in a very biased way. And the way to overcome that is essentially using technology. That's one of the reasons why my research lab now develops digital twins. Because in a digital twin, you can use data that's, for example, already sitting in an IT system like SAP and build an accurate model of not just a business process or full business, but even a whole supply chain. And what you can do is then use that digital twin to test assumptions around decisions. What's the best possible decision of how should I be managing my inventory? How should I be allocating capacity? How should I make buy decisions? All of these things, there's a lot of uncertainty and variability, and our human mind simply can't cope with it. So those are the two primary ones. Is emotions really impact us, and then we need a way of overcoming that emotional bias. And the second one is the level of VUCA in the system, sort of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, constraints, and ambiguity of competing objective. It makes it very difficult to know what the best decision is, and that problem can be solved with digital twins.
Interesting. And what about making decisions, not necessarily technology decisions or business decisions, but decisions in our personal lives? So is there anything that you based on your research know that we are tripping on or making that lead to bad decisions?
Sure. So I think that the first thing is to give ourselves credit. It's we are making around 35,000 decisions every single day. Luckily, most of them are on the subconscious mind, and they're being made in fully automatic mode. What we eat, what we say, how we dress, how we get to work, all of those things, right? But there's a few of them that matter a lot. And getting those right or wrong can make a big difference. So there's this very useful framework that we teach in decision making, which is E+R = O. So E stands for the events that happen to us in our personal life or in our business. The R is the response, and the O is the outcome. So the mistakes that we can make is we become anxious about events that actually is not important, or we can't do anything about it, right? So we need to make sure that whatever event happened is really important to us in our personal life or in business, and that we can actually do something about it. The second mistake we make is we don't respond, we react in fully automatic mode, and that can often cause us to overreact or underreact. And the last mistake that we make is that on the outcome side, we actually seldom think about what's the outcome I really want, and then decide what's the best possible response to get me there. So imagine an event happened, right? Your subordinate says something that you believe is disrespectful. It triggers you, you react to it, you lose your temper, right? And the outcome is that they lose their respect for you. Right? You feel fully justified to lose your temper. They feel fully justified to disrespect you now even more. Compared to saying, okay, they said something that was disrespectful. Most likely it wasn't their intent, right? But still you felt that they were disrespecting you. So now you can think about it as a good leader, right? Or as a good parent, if it's a personal thing. What is the outcome I want? I want them to be aware that what they said is disrespectful. I want to let them think about it and make sure that it doesn't happen again. And now I think, okay, to achieve that outcome, what's the best possible response? And just taking that brief moment where we are resisting the temptation to react immediately can help any situation be better or even much better. If we allow ourselves to react, especially if it's in a negative way, we can make any situation worse or even much worse.
Yeah. So maybe switching gears a little bit here. We spoke about constraints, we spoke about improving flow. So I just wanted to pick your brain on how do we identify some of the constraints that are existing in our belief systems? So is there some way for us to kind of figure that out as well using the theory of constraints?
Yes, so in theory of constraints, Dr. Goldratt developed the thinking processes, and there are a number of them. There's a thinking process called the current reality tree, the future reality tree, the evaporating cloud, strategy and tactic tree, transition trees, etc. all of these thinking processes basically share one objective. When we are mapping out our logic, whether it's necessity-based logic, where we say, in order to achieve this goal, I must do the following, or sufficiency logic, that by doing this, this will happen. All of these tools help us to verbalize our assumptions. When we verbalize our assumptions, it moves it from the subconscious to the conscious. Once it's in the conscious, we have written it down, we've typed it into an app. We can then look at them and go, really? Is that really true? Right? So the generic way of exposing our assumptions is by being asked the right question, right? As imagine somebody that's struggling with quitting smoking, right? And you want to find out what's their limiting assumption or belief. Do you think that there's a chance that their limiting assumption or belief is that somehow smoking is good for them?
No, I don't think so.
No, they definitely not ignorant, right? There's like the joke where the guy walks up to the woman that's smoking saying, "Excuse me, ma'am, your smoking is bothering me." And she goes, "Bothering you? It's killing me," So it's very seldom ignorance. What you want to ask yourself, if you have an addiction yourself or somebody else that's struggling with it, is what are you scared of giving up if you stop tomorrow? And if somebody is smoking, most often the answer will be, it helps me to cope with stress. Or it helps me.
Because people typically go smoking together with someone else.
Right. It helps me to form connections, right? Now, as soon as you say that, now you've written it down. Now the mind can start questioning it, right? The first one is it really true? Does smoking actually help me cope with stress? Or is my mind fooled, right? I'm starting to run low on nicotine. I replenish the nicotine. It gives me relief. And now I feel less stress, but it has nothing to do with my stress level. It's really about replenishing nicotine, okay? The other assumption is that the best way? Even if it did help, is it the best or the only way to cope with it? No, well, how do other people cope with it? Well, some people do exercise, some people meditate, right? Some people do breathing exercises. So that's the key for finding these limiting assumptions or beliefs, is asking yourself the right question. And once you answer the question, you've written it down, then you can say, really? Is that really true? What else could be true? What else can give me that? One way that I've developed to help people verbalize and challenge one of our most limiting assumptions is when we think that something is impossible. That's my passion, right? Helping individuals and companies achieve impossible goals or make impossible decisions or solve impossible problems. And a generic solution to all of those is you ask yourself or you ask them, it's impossible unless. And that basically disrupts the brain, because what happens when we say it's impossible? It's essentially a protection mechanism, right? So not only we won't even try, we won't even think about trying. So we say it's impossible.
Yeah, it also tells you all the reasons why we can't achieve it.
Exactly. But now I'm asking you, it's impossible to achieve this target unless, I was interviewed recently by a very famous author, and he said, well, give me a practical example. I said, okay, well, what's one of your goals? And he said, I've just published a new book. I want to sell ambitiously 100,000 copies. And I said, well, do you think it's possible? He said, it won't be easy, but it's possible. I said, okay, what do you think would be impossible? And he said, 1 million copies. I said, okay, it's impossible to sell 1 million copies unless. And immediately he started laughing and he goes, oh my goodness, I can feel it working, right? I can immediately think of many things, like if I can get on Oprah, or I can get a referral by Tony Robbins, somebody that's huge in my field, I would sell 1 million copies, right? Said exactly. So that's one way, is just asking the right question and allowing your mind to answer it honestly. And then when you write down that reason, then asking yourself, is that really true? What if the opposite was true?
Yeah, that's great. One of the things that I have realized from experience and from having read many great authors is that the way our brain or mind works is that, it answers any question that we ask of it. So if we ask a question of why can't we do something, it will give you an answer for why we can't do something. If you ask it, how do I do something, it will give you an answer on how do you do something. So it's
kind of like ChatGPT.
Yeah, exactly. We need to learn prompt engineering, not just for working with ChatGPT, but for working with ourselves as well.
Yeah, exactly. And the more specific and clear you are with your question, the better the answers. One of Dr. Goldratt's mottos were the best solutions, the biggest breakthroughs starts with the right question. We hire experts not to give us the right solution. We hire experts to ask us the right question. What is that one thing that if you change it, will change everything for you?
So that brings me to the next question, which is obvious, right? So how do I, as a leader, learn how to ask the right questions?
I think the first thing is the basic foundation is to be curious, right? And what attracted me to the goal was in the foreword of the goal. I'm sure you remember that. Dr. Goldratt describes to me in the most simple terms the scientific method, right? He said, to make a breakthrough in any field that you're passionate about, you just require 2 steps. The first step is have the courage to face an inconsistency. And the second step is have the courage to challenge basic assumptions. So if you think about a great leader, right? A great leader is curious, but they're not curious about everything. They're curious about inconsistencies between what should be possible and what the actual result is. And then being able to ask questions to allow people to share their assumptions, and then being willing to help them check and challenge those assumptions. So that to me is a good framework, right, of knowing what questions to ask is to look for those expectation gaps or performance gaps and ask the question, I'm curious, our constraint when we bought it, that caster, right, is able to do 3 million tons a year. We are only producing 2.6 million. How can it be? Why are we losing, the rest? Our best salesperson is selling 10 units a month. The average salesperson is selling 2. How can it be? Why is there such a big gap? So being able to look for those inconsistencies, and there's inconsistencies at every level. The most easiest one to look for, if I go into an industry, Mukesh, that I have no intuition, right? I remember being asked to go to Japan and working with Daiwa House, one of the biggest construction companies and home builders, right? At that stage, I knew nothing about houses, never mind houses in Japan, apart from having my own house, right? And I go like, Dr. Barnard, can you help them increase their sales? Like, what do you do? So what I did was I had all the salespeople in the room, and I said to them, who's the top salesperson here? Who sells the most houses? And they told me this person's name. And I said, how much does the average salesperson sell? So I'm looking for an inconsistency between one person selling 10 and the other one selling 2. How can it be? And now I'm bringing them forward and I say, can you explain to me why you sell 10 and the rest 2? And you know what he said to me? He said, nobody's ever asked him that question. Because people just thought he's lucky, he's selling in a region where there's very little competition or whatever it is. So that to me is the curiosity has to come from not curious about everything, curious about the performance and the expectation gaps, and then asking why.
Very interesting. And I also think that doing this gives a leader the ability to ask why and why not, both. So once you've identified why is there an inconsistency, excuse me, they can then go on and ask, okay, how do
Why
we
not? Why can't we
why
close it?
not? Yeah, correct.
Absolutely, absolutely. And because it could be, right, if you think about step 2 as being willing to challenge assumptions, there's only 2 assumptions that's relevant when we see a gap. There's the assumption on which our expectations were based, and there's an assumption on which the actions were based to realize that expectation. Unfortunately, when there's expectation gaps, it causes stress and anxiety. So we can't tolerate it for long. So guess what people do? They do one of 2 things, neither of which is very productive. Firstly, they find somebody to blame, right? Or secondly, they lower their expectations.
To match the current reality.
Exactly. Rather than saying, what actions did we take to realize those expectations? And what's the assumptions on which we base that assumptions? I'll give you an example of something that you mentioned earlier that I think is really critical for leaders. The question is, how should we measure people? Should we measure them on the performance that they are achieving? Or should we measure them on the compliance to the rules that we've decided is the best way to achieve the performance? Now, you know which is the most common one. We measure them by performance,
Individual
right?
performance. Yeah.
And then we are surprised that they don't comply to the rules. And now when we don't get the result, we will never know. Is it because we're using the wrong rules? Or is it because the rules are not being complied to? I had a recent case with a very large mining company. They were using SAP, and for some reason they got convinced that there's another software for maintenance that's better than the SAP module for maintenance. So they invested in this, right? And they asked me to go and do an audit to see that they actually get the results of this big investment that was almost $100 million into this maintenance software. And it was clear that they didn't. So then I said, I wanted to check the compliance. So of all the recommendations that the software is making of what to buy, when to buy it, how much to buy, what is the level of compliance? Mukesh, it was 50%. Right? So now the problem is, I will never know. Is it the bad recommendations or the non-compliance? Right? And for me, the recommendation is you should measure and reward performance at the company level. But everybody else, the primary measurement should be, listen, we agree on what rules that will optimize the system, not the parts of the system. And your job is to comply to these rules. And if for whatever reason you don't think it's a good idea to comply, it's not your job to decide. Please escalate it, right? Please escalate it, because there might be a good reason why we should break the rule. So every time you find, oh, there's another, we can create rules to break the rules, but it shouldn't be up to you. Whereas if we only measure them on performance and we don't care their level of compliance, as long as they meet the targets, they will never comply to all the standard operating policies.
Absolutely. And I think this has been one of my rants across a lot of my podcast episodes. People who know me well, they also have heard this so many times that now they are tired of me saying that, we should not be rewarding people on individual performance, because what happens is then they optimize for themselves. In a company like SAP, where we have some last count, I have 3,700 products on the product price list, and each one of them has a different sort of competitor. And if you optimize for individual performance, and someone is responsible for selling, let's say, an ERP license vis-a-vis a supply chain license, someone else is selling, and the customer really needs supply chain license first, because that's where their biggest area of improvement is. And if both of these guys go in, they know that there is limited budget that the customer has, and they start sabotaging each other, and which is a recipe for disaster. I mean, It's not just SAP. I can tell you, I've seen this across so many different organizations, across so many different industries, and
Right.
makes me feel sad for them, and at the same time angry that such a simple thing that people do not want to change about.
Right. And, Dr. Goldratt, one of his famous quotes is, show me how you measure me, I will show you how I behave. Right. If I don't understand your measurement, not even I can predict how I will behave. But that's something that we've seen, is that in many organizations, the core problem in the organization is local optimization measurements. So the connection between the constraint and the core problem is the core problem is the behavior that's causing us to waste a scarce resource, right? And often it is not ignorance, it is just the wrong measurement. And the steel industry is a very good example. Another key aspect, we talked about Tata Steel UK, is imagine if your primary measurement is tons per hour, right? What will the casters do? What will the mill do?
So
They will produce those products that maximizes their tons per hour, right? Does that explain why their due date performance is 30%? Because the primary measurement is not due date performance, it's tons per hour. You meet your tons per hour goal, we'll leave you alone, right? You don't meet your tons per hour goal, we're all over you. So you choose, right? And that's why they can't escape out of this vicious cycle where they're producing stuff that's not needed now. And as a result, they don't have enough capacity to produce what is needed. And that causes due date performance to be shockingly bad, lead time is shockingly long, and they can't get out of that vicious cycle unless a leader comes in with the courage to change the measurement.
Yeah. I think we have 3 minutes left for the time that we have for our conversation today. But if it is okay to go 5 minutes beyond, I have one question which I have not gotten to yet. So Dr. Goldratt spoke about viable vision. But I think he passed away too soon for him to actually realize that vision. So where does that vision stand? And if you can just take 2 minutes to explain what viable vision is and share with us where, if someone is actually working on it, do we have any real life case study where it has actually been achieved? That will be really great.
Yeah. So we started that initiative back in 2005, and it started with Ellie challenging business owners to have a target that is so ambitious they believe it's impossible. And he challenged them to have a target of turning their top line into their bottom line in 4 years or less. And the viable vision, what it stands for, is that vision is, what do I need to change to make it a huge win for my customers, so that customers will willingly pay more, buy more frequently. And then the viability part is, how do I do that in a profitable way? So by the time that Dr. Goldratt passed away in 2011, we already had 5 years of case studies that showed that in many industries that we never thought that this was possible, that actually it was possible with the right leadership, using the right focusing methodology like theory of constraints. A good example is a company I work with in South Africa, Premier Foods, staple food company, 150 years old, razor thin margins. They were one of the viable vision projects. They grew the company's market capitalization by 7,200% over a 6-year period. The highest growth on any company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange at that stage. So certainly it is possible to do that. And we still challenge companies to do that and coach them through figuring out what's the few things that they can change to make that seemingly impossible goal possible.
Super. So last 3 questions that we end all our conversations with. First is, one of the things that is super important is to constantly learn and reinvent ourselves and keep us up to date. So what is your way of continuous learning?
Yeah, I consume a lot of information. I read, I use apps like Blinkist that allows me to read a summary of the book in, 15 minutes. And then if it's very important, I will go and get the full book. I also listen to the audiobook. It helps me retain more while I'm reading and listening at the same time. I watch YouTube videos of experts in my field. I attend masterminds, but also I'm still involved in academia. So I normally supervise a few PhDs, and that keeps me sharp in terms of what the latest research is, etc.
Super. So the second one is there any piece of resource, could be book, could be a video, could be anything that has had a significant impact on your life? I mean, apart from Dr. LA, of course.
Yes, of course, Dr. Ellie Goldratt is right at the top of my list, but there's a couple of other people that I've really studied very carefully. Herbert Simon is one of them. He was one of the founding fathers of AI and operations research. He was actually the one that I picked up. I read a paper from him in 1972, where he said that, in the past, data was the bottleneck, right? We didn't have access to all the relevant data to make decisions. He said in the future, we will have not just enough, but too much data. The ability to process the data will become the bottleneck. And he was the first one to have identified that human attention, being able to take in data and convert it into information, that's going to be the ultimate bottleneck. And he said that the higher you go in an organization, the narrower the bottleneck becomes, because you have access to more and more data. The other person that's really had a big impact on my life is Nassim Taleb, that wrote Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, and Anti-Fragile. Anti-Fragile specifically provides a wonderfully simple but profound framework to think about how do I classify not just organizations, but people in terms of how they respond to stresses. If they are harmed more by negative stress than what they can benefit from a positive stress, they are fragile. An anti-fragile system or person is one that has figured out ways of mitigating a negative stress and can fully capitalize on a positive stress. So those are a few people just off the top that's really made a big impact on my life.
Super. So the last question that we end our show all the time is, the show is called Pushing Beyond the Obvious. So what is so obvious to you that people miss and that makes you go, ah?
Yeah, people think they learn from experience. We do not learn from experience. We learn from experiments. Unless you are explicit about the assumption you want to test, and then testing that assumption, not with a minimally viable product, but with a minimally viable experiment, right? You will never learn the lesson. So for me, kind of in a summary that I want to leave the audience with, what is theory of constraints? I think it can be described by sort of 5 words, right? It's all about flow, increasing the flow through any system, whether it's an income or impact. It's all about focusing on those few things that really make a big difference, finding where the constraint is and the core problem that's blocking us from better exploiting or elevating the constraint. The third word is finishing. Once I start something, to finish it. And then the last 2 words is fast feedback, is to treat every single decision that you make as an experiment to learn from. What worked, what didn't work, and not spreading your resources thinly by doubling down the things that work and stopping those things that are not working. So flow, focus, finish, fast feedback.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnard, for sharing your insights with us. Can you please let people know where they can find out more about yourself, your company, and the apps that you mentioned? We didn't get a chance to go deeper into the apps, but please do let people know where they can find more information.
Sure. The apps you can find on harmonyapps.com. One of the simplest apps is called Harmony Decision Maker. It's available on all the app store. It's a free app, and that can guide you through making any decision, personal decision or business decision. And it's been designed to help you avoid these common mistakes, help you to find and overcome limiting assumptions. In terms of resources, I have a YouTube channel. All my social media handles are just Dr. Alan Barnard. So have a look at my YouTube channel. There's hundreds and hundreds of hours of free videos of insights that I've gained, case studies that has been presented. And then also on LinkedIn, we put a lot of content out. So people are welcome to go on there. And lastly, I have a podcast series called It's Impossible Unless. That's on all the podcast channels. So that's the other opportunity for me to share new ideas and insights.
Super. And I cannot recommend highly enough. I have devoured the content that you've put out on YouTube. Thank you so much for doing all of that.
Thank you, Mukesh.